and more of the sciences before moving into the nonprofit space and advocacy. And I've been with OAC for about 4 years now. And our mission is to protect the environment and health of all Ohio communities through legal and policy advocacy, decision maker accountability, and civic engagement. And in 2026, OAC, CLEB, and the Old Woman Creek National Estuary Preserve has put on these policy trainings, and this is the last 2 sessions of the 4 sessions. And together these sessions will equip the Central Lake Erie Basin Collaborative and others with the knowledge, confidence, and tools needed to participate effectively in water policy advocacy across the Central Lake Erie Basin. So thank you again for coming out. And we will focus on communication skills, teaching participants how to craft compelling stories today, and translate technical information, and communicate their work in ways that resonate with policymakers. That's often hard since they don't get all the nitty-gritty details that watershed groups and others go into. And we'll also prepare participants to take meaningful advocacy steps by exploring strategies for building relationships with policymakers, preparing for meetings, and identifying opportunities to engage. So I hope this is really helpful for folks. Go ahead and get started. These are some of the session goals I've named. Understand why storytelling matters in policy spaces, learn a simple framework for crafting compelling stories, practice translating technical information into accessible language, build and deliver a short policy relevant story today, and identify real advocacy moments to use your story. And this will really build, you may see some familiar slides from previous sessions if you've been to the other ones. So why storytelling matters. Policymakers remember stories more than statistics, believe it or not. When you have that face-to-face or that compelling story that really engages the lawmaker, they tend to remember that more than a statistic, even though they need those statistics sometimes when they're up talking to their committee or whoever it may be. Stories create urgency, relevance, and emotional connection. As we all have conversations with people, there's people just like us, and you can really build that connection with a good story. Technical work becomes powerful when it's translated into human impact. So when we're doing work, it's important to include that human perspective. And advocacy is not dumbing down, but it's making informational usable. You can talk about things in more than one way. And so policy change doesn't happen because of one meeting or one email. It happens because of relationships that are consistent, trusted, credible relationships. And policymakers rely on people like you to understand what's happening on the ground. When you show up regularly, you become that go-to resource. And that's where influence really grows. So just a reflection, maybe think of a moment when your work made a difference and hold on to that for later. And this is a framework you can use when building a story. There's the clear, if you sort of remember that phrase, clear. C is the context. So what is the big thing that you're trying to give context around for a policymaker? Maybe it's clarity on an issue. So an example I have, H2 Ohio contributes to a healthier water in Ohio. That's some context around this issue. H2 Ohio, I'm trying to share a story about, but also have some change on. L stands for lived experience. So again, giving that human perspective. An example would be, I have lead service lines in my house. So H2 Ohio helps remove lead service lines. So you start with that piece, H2 Ohio is important. I have lead service lines in my house, so it directly impacts me. E is for evidence. So maybe putting in a little data point there doesn't hurt. So the Army Corps of Engineers rates Ohio's water a D+. So we have, some evidence that our water is failing us right now. And, or maybe Alliance of the Great Lakes found that Ohio is third in the nation for most lead service lines. These are deep hitting points to show that, when you're talking to the policymaker, you're making it relevant for them in the form of it's Ohio, and then later we'll talk about even making it more relevant to their district. And then A is action needed. So what are you there asking for? In this example, it'd be fully fund H2 Ohio. R is result. So if we remove all of the lead service lines in Ohio, then we will meet the federal lead and copper rule. And if you sort of put this together in a narrative, or you have these bullets going into the meeting, it really equips you for those things that policymakers want to hear. So remember that clear story framework. What else does policymakers need? With the story, they need some clarity. So again, that context and clarity kind of go together. They don't know what you're here to talk about. They need to have that in their mind. It really needs to be clear. And then brevity, keep it short. In meetings and touch bases, you don't have much time. There's maybe 15, 30 minutes or less, and really keeping it short and to the point helps them. And then you need relevance to constituents. So often it's helpful if you live in a district and you're the one talking, or you call upon someone who lives in the district to go and send that message for you. Also a clear ask. So that goes along with the clear story framework and the brevity and clarity. There needs to be an action that they can take, what's relevant to them, and a sense of what success looks like. So let's look at the painted picture on the other side of this. What is a world that we can imagine if something is done, and it could be their accomplishment. Translating technical information, there's sort of 3 techniques that I like to use. There's a plain language swap. We'll see some examples on the next slide. Analogies, and you always want to lead with impact and not the process. Because a lot of these things, they can have different pathways to get there, but really you want, that goal, and maybe you can work with them on how to reach that. So some examples of plain language swap is if you're talking about nutrient loading. That's a common term among us, but maybe it's not well understood. You could say too much fertilizer washing into the water, or HABs mitigation, steps we can take to prevent toxic algae from forming. These are, turning a phrase into a sentence or another phrase that sort of breaks it down but is saying the same thing, less technical. Or there's an analogy, wetlands act like nature's kidneys. So we all, have a common understanding of what kidneys do for the most part, and putting that analogy to it really helps understand, what wetlands actually do. Impact first. So we found toxins at levels that could affect kids swimming at the beach. Kids is always, an important thing. We want healthy things, waterways for our children, and so it's really, impacting the youth as well as everybody else, and targeting that helps instead of, we need to clean up our waterways. It's what's the impact of if we don't. So we're just gonna do a quick activity. We're gonna have only about 5 minutes to do this, but maybe if you can turn to your partner to the left, I would say, or however it matches up. And just, if you have a pad and paper, or maybe you can talk about it, rewrite one technical phrase from your work in plain language and share that with your partner. So we'll have about 5 minutes, but I'm gonna think about one thing you could break down and share that with your neighbor or group. Great job, and again, multiple impacts, so reaching economists or both sides of the aisle on different issues. It's great. I think the result could also be what you had mentioned before, is clean beaches prior to that evidence, and then pulling in the people who are actually living the experience is great too, to have that person you're not only referencing, but they're there to share, and it's more emotional. And you don't have to necessarily put these in this order, if something kind of naturally flows better, but I think it's just easier to remember when you have this nomenclature, and easier to walk through too in your head. So yeah, think about that too. Any feedback on their story? Any ideas? Thanks for participating. I don't know if we necessarily need the last part of this activity since everyone's stories are so great, but maybe if you have any revisions after hearing others, maybe you can raise your hand or call them out now instead of taking the time in your group to. Does anybody have anything they would change?
I mean, I definitely think with our group, you know, kind of maybe not specifying those specifically, maybe going with like beach monitoring data or something that's more recognizable to the general public, would definitely be, you know, more advantageous.
I don't know what we can do, cause like, you know, I think if you see and then they'll walk around and usually we're meeting with multiple different, congressional staff, in different places, so, but whatever you can do ahead of time to figure out what important things are to them, and then tweaking the story to see that perspective.
I would say the same thing, like, so when I used to be a regional director at the Art Association, when we would do like that, it's making sure there are volunteers that were, want to speak to represent us, because we didn't have staff, we had the volunteers go out, so people who actually live in those communities. We would give everybody a sheet, so they would have a sheet, they would have something to do with a staffer, and so, whatever they say, they also, you know, let them in, so that, you know, helped to make sure that they had a message, so they could go back and go, like, I bet somebody came, but I really don't remember what they said, so we tried to make sure that, like, all of those things were in brief notes, for them too.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about leave behinds later, but and I think you even called out, you almost had the last policy training. I looked up what their wives do and, you know, connected to them on that level. It's like, you can, if you feel confident enough to change your message based on who you're meeting with. If you're meeting with multiple people in one day, you know, tailoring some of those instead of listing all of them, maybe really honing in on what would they listen to most is effective. Yeah.
But, especially with staffers, cause, they have a diverse background, one of the things that I've done is ask them what their lived experience is, at the beginning of the conversation, like, 'cause sometimes there's that walk back to wherever you're going, and so, you know, interestingly enough, like, you know, some of them even had connections to the creek, at some point in time, and so being able to pull that into the conversation, if you're good on the spot doing those kinds of things, is good.
Anything else?
I don't wanna speak for you, Elizabeth, but after we got everything down, Elizabeth was like, oh, you know what, they might not even care about that, the township might care more about the road and the nature to the road, so I think that just speaks on what you guys were talking about with figuring out what people you're presenting to prioritize. And I guess there's a bunch of different strategies to do that, and that's what I'm interested in. Are you stalking them on social media, or doing a survey, I don't know.
I think generally even in their bios, if they have a bio, it shows their big wins or what they've done in their career in the past. And so if they, you know, championed a big bill on roadways, then yeah, you know, going in there and relating it to that, because, you know, I think this work, as several of you have called out, is very cross-sector when you start to think about it. And so how does it bleed into other work that they are engaging in if it's not directly environmentalism or waterways?
And sometimes it talks about their hobbies, so if their hobbies is fishing, you know, so we get a lot of people that are like, I like to fish. And it's like, okay, well, since you like to fish, let me tell you about the water.
And I also like, you can look at their social media feed, because sometimes they have those well-drafted bios, like, it's very select, but in your social media, even if it's done by a communication specialist, it's still a big indicator because of the frequency, what they're really interested in, what they're actively doing. But
Yep, so we are stalking on social media. In this case, if it gets good stuff done, then it's okay.
for higher purpose.
So, yeah, and sometimes I walk into an office and there's like pictures of fish everywhere, and it's like, okay, on the top of my head, I'm gonna change it because I didn't realize that was a thing here. Cool, anything else? Alright, well, again, this is a casual space, so feel free to, you know, stand up terrible. So I want you to do what your body needs to. But we are going to move on and talk about using stories in advocacy. So where stories matter in district meetings, we kind of talked a little bit about round tables. There's been some folks in this room to be hosting those recently. Tours, which I know I'm doing a lot of this summer. Hope to invite you all to those. Testimony, when you are, at the State House or for a piece of legislation and talking about it. If you're in DC, talking about a piece of legislation, or if you're even at a agency rulemaking hearing and providing testimony on a rule. Those are good places to be sharing stories, as well as in emails. You can have these short lawmaker touch points, even if it feels unknown. If you don't know the staff, send them your story, introduce yourself, and then if you have more stories coming that you find in your field of expertise, send those. Social media is a great place to share stories, especially when you're strategic about the timing. If there's, a certain bill that's going to be passed, GLRI is still heavily in my mind since it's in the Senate. We're thinking about the fall being a good time to share those stories, and so thinking about when it's a good time. And then coalition conversations. So sharing your stories within a network to share out for you. They often have those connections to reporters or more media, and sometimes your story can get picked up and you have someone sending it to you in paper and you're like, oh, well, I'm glad that got shared out more broadly. So those are just some examples, and I wanted to give an OEC example. This was one that we put a video together and shared in multiple different places, including our website, so that continues to get more hits, and we tried to keep it pretty general to continue educating.
Ohio's greatest treasure sits right on top of its head, Lake Erie. It's one of the Great Lakes. It's part of one of the largest surface freshwater systems in the world. And due to its important ecological and economic value, it's the reason many of us Ohioans ended up here in the first place.
Educational video, but it has storytelling components, and you can kind of see where it walks through that clear in your head. And this would be perfect to send in an email to lawmakers, share on social media, any of these times. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a verbal story. Maybe you're interviewing someone, or you're putting an animation together like this. So your story can also look different. Yeah.
I noticed that's about a minute and a half long. Is that kind of a good length to target for communication? That if you're going to send it in an email, or?
I think so, or maybe even shorter nowadays. I mean, they say that people have a really short span, and
60 seconds.
with reels, and they're maybe 45 seconds. It's like sometimes if it's in that fashion, at least on social media. But I think in an email, this would be something that they would stay around for. So I'd gauge for a minute or under in some of your outreach in that form.
And so you email it to like the policymakers office, and their staff will look at it? Or
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about like who to outreach to, but there's different staffers, and they're always changing, unfortunately, in these offices, and so it's tougher to form relationships due to that. But there's different staff in the offices, different folks you can email to.
Some colleagues of mine took a video like this with them when they were doing Capitol Hill visits, and sat and watched it with them. I thought that was potentially awkward, but it seemed to work for them. So I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there, but they seem to like it. It is a nice crafted message, and you're not as then you can have answered questions, as opposed to remembering the narrative that you wanna say.
Yeah, it's a great different approach. I mean, I haven't seen it done, but you know, district meetings, it is a place to do that if you got the iPad or easy ability to, and then, yeah, you don't have to spend so much time, it's more of a visual and an audio thing, and then you can answer questions the rest of the time or talk more in depth. It's cool. Yep.
I think that,
And we also have to. Anything else here? Any questions, comments? Okay, pairing your story with data. So, stories create connection. I think you nailed that point home. But data really provides credibility to your story. So it's not just you sharing, it's more of a regional thing. And, you know, I think one of the stories that was shared, it was district relative, but then it called back to that national or regional, like it is everywhere. And so, you know, that is meaningful in what's going on in one place solutions could be shared in another place. So data really provides credibility. It's important to get some reports funded for data collection, and monitoring is important, even though nobody wants to fund it, but it shows a lot of good data. And then together they really drive action. So here's an example, OACI, Ohio Agriculture Conservation Initiative. It's a board I sit on, and OAC has been a part of making. We just came out with our assessment report for the Western Lake Erie Basin, and you can see some of the findings there, but it really, this assessment report is supposed to complement H2 Ohio's practices in assessing the basin through its soil tests and soil conservation, soil and water conservation districts, collect this data from farms, and then we come back every 3 years. Sometimes we're a little behind, but we did one in the Lower Maumee in 2019, and then this had some of the same counties, so it was still comparable this year. And so it really showed that practices are being adopted through H2 Ohio, and that they are reducing nutrients and what practices are. So it assesses, you know, the ground as well as farmer practices. So great report, check it out. And we're trying to do that every 3 years and come back and see, you know, are we still keeping up with what we promised? But there is really a balance between successes and needs. When you're sharing these stories, you know, you want to highlight what is winning, what is working, but also, you know, what else do we need? And sometimes going heavy one way or the other isn't effective. So really balancing that is helpful. And really encourage you to have a real person or place. You know, when you're sharing these stories, have someone who is affected, or if you're having them out to a tour, having a place where you can put a visual to it. And sometimes that sticks, a person or a place. And also a district level connection, which I mentioned. You know, they don't necessarily care what's going around the rest of the state because they, you know, are so localized in what they can do in their area. And then a clear ask. Always, you know, maybe it's not that process, but a clear ask in what you want and what you can communicate to them and what they can do. And here's just another reference you can use in building your story. You want to have that story of yourself or the call to leadership, which kind of leads into your purpose for being there. And so a story of now, or a strategy or action, and what you can do. And then some urgency is created through the story of us. So, you know, you have that self, this is how it affects me. You have this is what's happening on the ground, and then you have here's how we can come together to make change, and it will affect the community. And so these kind of are rotated in how you want to put this together, but these are also good points to kind of think about it in a different way than the clear in building your story. Any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
And this might be a little specific, but it relates to the slide previous about sharing data. On the topic of climate change and how that's become such a partisan issue, I noticed it was touched on in the video. Are we not mentioning it to certain policymakers, or because they might discredit you immediately if you mention it, or are we being genuine and respectful of the data and just continuing to mention it until they listen? Like, what's the strategy?
Great question. I think that depends on your organization or your individual values and what you want to lean into. I know some folks have cut that language completely, or maybe in their grants they have to, or they're not going to get funded. But I also know some, like our organization, is still talking about it and just maybe dimming it in some rooms more than others. I think there's different language you can use also. Maybe it's not climate action or climate change, but maybe it's like changing of the weather or different ways. Yeah, there you go, extreme weather.
Summer, I think we're getting hotter weather and more storms. Everybody's noticed that.
All the farmers know.
All the
more intense rain events.
farmers have noticed. It's hot, it's harder for them to get their crops, in at the right time, just the heat and the rain.
Yeah, I was gonna get back to similar to what she said in terms of, I don't have to say climate change, because my concern right here and now is the impacts. And I can talk about impacts without saying climate change. So whether it's, farmers being able to get out in the field because there's been, a lot of rain recently or whatever weather events, or I'm a landowner and my house is falling into the lake, I don't have to say climate change, but I can talk about impact, and that's really what matters.
Great recommendation.
Unless you're trying to support long-term monitoring, which I also try to do, that's a different problem.
Right.
We're on climate change, and I'll just try and be brief, but this is big. But my daughter is a river guide, and she's at this basically conference of river guides on a river. And her story was she herself is and people are afraid, people are worried. She said she's brilliant people here, they just want to know how to tackle it like we tackled, the degradation of the lakes and rivers 50 years ago plus. And her story is my home river normally flows at this level of 1,300 CFS or something, and after rain it would go to 1,800. This whole season it's been down 900 or below, and I came out to Moab and it rained all night and I practically cried because of the sound of the rain. So this was yesterday's conversation, and she said she's in with this group of people who are committed and know what's going on, and they have an audience, they have people going down the river with them, but it's like, where do you start? Sorry for bringing up.
Great story, and I think it's everyone. There's a lot of stories out there like that right now. You hear even in Colorado, they've had the lowest snowfall that they've had since recorded history, and how does that impact everything else that we do? And
but then if you're looking at advocacy, so 1969, Carl Stokes was very strategic about this is bad. They've known it was bad for a very long time, and he's kind of channeled the nation's press to this event, the fire. So he had kind of a way he was going, but if you've got a bunch of people who are just
that takes working with them too, you know, really making a lot of this is education to policymakers as well. So educating them on what's happening, and then, you know, it's up to them to see those connections sometimes to really have to form those asks, or, you know, maybe it starts on the local level. That's a part of what we're here to do today. What's one community doing, or how are they talking about it, and how can we start talking about it here once it, you know, starts to spread that education on the local and all levels. It is like a wildfire on its own that, you know, sort of the solutions start coming. And so I think education is an important first step in a lot of this.
And I think it's better to educate the community first before a lot of the lawmakers. Just to say the data center conversation, you know, it was the community that said, hold on, what's going on? And they literally went to the law and said, we don't want data centers here. But we have 217 in Ohio already. And so, you know, the important part of that is, you know, for us now to stand our ground, particularly in neighborhoods like Salt Village, for the people, residents in the city of Cleveland, because they're going to try to sneak it in. Like, that's one of the reasons why they're trying to change the language. And that's one of the reasons why they will not revise their air quality code. You know, the air quality code in the city of Cleveland and a lot of these other districts around, these areas around, have not been changed since I was 10 years old, and I'm almost 60, okay? So, that is ridiculous. I have grandchildren now, and we have not changed the air quality code since 1977. I mean, that is, you know, absolutely, like, where else would they do this at? And it's like here, you know, when we look at this air quality code in Akron, but it's part of the community. So how do you get a groundswell community members to say it's important for city council to vote for the best interest of the community?
And even there's tools in the toolbox. I was just in here in Cleveland last week at the planning and zoning workshop, and gave a talk about things that you can write into your zoning codes that haven't been updated since the towns were created. And so, you know, using those in creative ways, but really you do see it on the ground first, and you know, corporations or developers or other people may see that too and take advantage. And so there needs to be some education and rallying for what's in your own backyard. Thank you. Okay, well, I think we're going to take a little break. That is the end